There's something special about the 1970s in America. A warmth, a rhythm, a pace of life that feels almost impossible today. It was a decade shaped by people whose work happened in the background, yet held communities together in ways we barely notice now. Back then, a familiar face delivered your milk to the doorstep. A switchboard operator connected your call with her hands. A gas station attendant checked your oil, cleaned your windshield and knew your name. These weren't just jobs. They were daily rituals, little moments of human connection that quietly built the world our parents grew up in. But as America changed through technology, policy, automation, lifestyle shifts, many of these professions began to fade. Some disappeared almost overnight. Others vanished slowly, quietly slipping into memory. Tonight, we're going to travel back into that world, to remember the people behind these lost jobs, to understand why they mattered, and to see what their disappearance tells us about how America transformed. This is Lost Jobs of 1970s America. 7 chapters, 7 stories, one forgotten side of a decade we still miss. Let's begin. Before sunrise in the 1970s, while most of the neighborhood was still asleep, a quiet routine unfolded across America. The sound was soft, barely noticeable, just the gentle rattle of glass bottles in a wire carrier. This was the milkman, a figure as ordinary as morning itself, yet deeply woven into daily American life. To understand why the milkman mattered, we have to step into the world before supermarkets took over. Fresh milk didn't sit on shelves for days. It didn't arrive in plastic jugs. It came directly to your doorstep in heavy glass bottles, filled just hours earlier at a local dairy. For millions of American families, the milkman wasn't just a delivery worker. He was part of the household rhythm. As predictable as the sunrise, children remembered the excitement, opening the door and finding cold glass bottles lined up neatly, condensation shining in the morning light. Parents appreciated the convenience, especially mothers caring for young children who relied on fresh dairy for cooking breakfast and daily routines. Most milkmen worked 6 days a week. They memorized the preferences of every house, who needed whole milk, who preferred skim, who wanted butter or eggs added to the crate. These tiny details built trust, the kind rarely found today. And then there was the small-town feeling. The milkman often knew the family dog, knew which kid was allergic to certain products, and sometimes even noticed when something wasn't quite right. Many Americans still remember stories like, "He saw my mother's car wasn't in the driveway for a week, so he asked a neighbor to check on her." These weren't just deliveries. They were acts of community care. In the early 1970s, America was still transitioning away from local economies. Refrigerators were smaller, often unreliable. Daily fresh goods were normal. Local dairies produced milk and sent it out the same morning. It didn't travel across states, and it didn't sit in massive storage facilities. Most neighborhoods relied on small-scale distribution, and home delivery was simply the most efficient method. Culturally, the milkman represented stability. For new suburban families building their lives, the arrival of the milkman felt like a quiet reassurance that the world was moving the way it should. A milkman's day began long before dawn. Around 2 or 3 a.m., they loaded heavy crates of glass bottles into insulated metal trucks. Routes covered dozens, sometimes over 100, homes each morning. The job was physically demanding, lifting 30-40-pound crates, walking icy driveways in winter, navigating neighborhoods in darkness. Yet many milkmen described the work as peaceful, a rare moment of stillness before the rest of the world woke up. It was, in many ways, the perfect quiet job in a noisy decade. But by the mid-1970s, the world was changing fast. Supermarkets expanded rapidly, offering everything under one roof. Cheaper, packaged, mass-produced, plastic milk jugs arrived. Lighter, cheaper, easier to store. Glass, while beautiful and nostalgic, was expensive and breakable. Refrigerators grew larger, letting families buy more and shop less often. Suburban sprawl stretched neighborhoods farther apart, making delivery routes inefficient. Labor costs rose. The once essential milkman became an expensive luxury. The decline was swift. By the late 1970s, many dairy companies shut down their delivery divisions. By the early 1980s, The milkman had all but disappeared from the American landscape. But what vanished wasn't only a job, it was a feeling, a sense of closeness, a shared neighborhood rhythm, a small but meaningful daily moment of human connection. The milkman symbolized trust, a person who stepped onto your property every morning, often without surveillance, without suspicion, without fear, a relationship built entirely on reliability. When the milkman disappeared, America didn't just gain convenience. It lost one of its quietest threads of community. And the story of the milkman tells us something larger, that America was shifting from local to mass production, from personal service to efficiency, from community-based living to consumer-based living. In many ways, the milkman is the perfect symbol of what America was and what it was becoming. And as the milkman faded from the American morning, another profession, one built entirely on human touch, was also approaching its end, a profession that connected voices, bridged distances, and kept families linked long before the digital age. Next, we step into the world of the switchboard operator, the women who literally held America's conversations in their hands. When we talk about the 1970s in America, we tend to remember the music, the fashion, the cars, or the shifting politics. But beneath all of that, beneath the cultural noise and the headlines, there was an entire workforce that quietly held the country together. A workforce made up of human beings, performing tasks that today would be handled by machines, apps, or automated systems. These jobs didn't just exist, they carried meaning, stability, and a sense of identity that is almost foreign in the digital age. In neighborhoods across the country, the day didn't begin with a smartphone notification. It began with the paperboy pedaling down the street at dawn. For millions of Americans, this was more than a simple delivery. It was a ritual, a sign that the world was still turning, that the news was still arriving, that life was still in motion. These kids learned responsibility, reliability, and the value of community interaction at an age when most children today haven't yet touched a dollar bill. Their roots weren't just geographic, they were social. They knew which houses had barking dogs, which customers preferred their newspaper tucked inside the screen door, and which elderly neighbors appreciated an extra knock on the door. Then there were the milk delivery drivers, still active in many towns. During the early 70s, these workers weren't just dropping off bottles, they were maintaining a rhythm of trust between families and local dairies. Parents didn't order milk through an app. They spoke to a real person who knew their household's habits. Some drivers even let themselves in through side doors, with permission, of course, placing milk directly into the family refrigerator. It was a level of familiarity and comfort hard to imagine today. Inside the home, technology was simpler and more fragile. When something broke, the solution wasn't to replace it, it was to repair it. And that's where the TV repairmen came in. These men carried heavy toolboxes filled with fuses, picture tubes, soldering irons and meters. They understood the anatomy of a television, the way a doctor understands the human body. A family might gather anxiously around them as they opened the back panel of the TV, revealing glowing tubes and wiring that seemed almost mystical. One twist of a knob, one replaced tube, and suddenly the picture returned, restoring the family's window to the world. These workers were not just technicians, they were problem solvers in an era before customer service, hotlines and warranty replacements. At transportation hubs, the human presence was even more essential. Train station porters, baggage handlers, and redcaps played a vital role in keeping America on the move. Travel in the 1970s was less automated, less streamlined, and often more chaotic. These workers helped elderly passengers navigate crowded stations, lifted heavy suitcases families couldn't manage, and guided travelers through unfamiliar terminals. For rail commuters, seeing the same porter every day created a sense of belonging, a human connection in the middle of a journey. And these are just the well-known examples. The deeper you go, the more you uncover a hidden universe of now extinct professions. Switchboard telephone operators who manually connected every call, film projectionists threading reels of celluloid through aging, projectors in local theaters, elevator operators controlling the smoother than automatic rides in department stores and hotels, bowling pin setters, who physically rearranged fallen pins before. Automation transformed the sport. Typists and stenographers, filling office floors with the rhythmic click of typewriters. Shoe shiners working in airports and downtown streets, giving travelers a moment of dignity. Photo booth clerks developing snapshots in tiny kiosks, long before smartphones made photography disposable. Each job had its own microculture, its own unwritten rules, its own network of relationships. These roles may seem small when viewed from today's high-tech vantage point, but they were deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life. They created stability for families, gave purpose to individuals, and shaped the community bonds that people still remember with warmth. More importantly, these roles represented a world where human presence mattered, where service wasn't anonymous, and where tasks weren't executed by silent algorithms in the background. People interacted, people depended on one another, and that dependency built trust, routine, and memory. But standing on the edge of the 1970s, a transformation was already beginning. The seeds of automation, digital communication, mass production, and corporate consolidation were being planted. A new era was rising, one that promised efficiency, speed, and convenience. Yet it was these very promises that slowly, quietly, and sometimes painfully erased the professions that once shaped America's heartbeat. Before they vanished, though, they defined an era where every service had a face, every task had a human story, and every community had workers whose names everyone knew. By the mid-1970s, the American workforce was standing at the edge of a silent revolution, one that didn't unfold with dramatic headlines or public protests, but through gradual, almost invisible changes that reshaped everyday life. The jobs that had once defined the heartbeat of American neighborhoods were beginning to fade, not because people suddenly stopped valuing them, but because the world around them was changing at a pace no one had fully prepared for. At the center of this shift was technology, growing faster and more disruptive than anyone anticipated. The decade introduced a wave of innovations that, at the time, seemed harmless. Convenient improvements, updates to make life a little easier. But what many failed to see was how these inventions would rewrite the rules of the labor market. Appliances became more resilient. Electronics became cheaper to replace. Companies discovered that mass production, even at lower quality, produced bigger profits than repair-based business models ever could. This meant the once essential TV, repairman, the household hero who breathed life back into flickering screens, was slowly pushed toward irrelevance. The bulky cathode ray sets of the 1960s were replaced by more integrated, sealed designs that discouraged repairs. Television companies even began training customers to expect failure. If it breaks, buy a new one. It was a new, corporate-driven version of the American dream, one that left the repairman behind. Parallel to this was the quiet collapse of the switchboard operator workforce. For decades, these operators, mostly women, formed the backbone of America's communication system. Every long-distance call, every emergency request, every transfer from business to business passed through their hands. Yet, with the introduction of automated switching systems, millions of calls no longer required a human touch. One device replaced dozens of workers. One programming upgrade ended entire careers. The transition was so efficient, so immediate, that many operators discovered their jobs were obsolete before they had time to retrain. The same fate hit America's transportation workers. As passenger rail travel declined due to interstate highways and affordable air transportation, train stations began to empty out. Once bustling terminals where porters, redcaps, and baggage handlers made a living helping travelers navigate their journeys gradually fell silent. Budget cuts eliminated the extra hands, and corporate restructuring replaced warm greetings with cold efficiency. Automated ticket machines appeared. Self-service became the norm. A traveler who once relied on the same smiling porter every morning now interacted with a screen that remembered nothing and cared even less. The disappearance of these roles wasn't merely the result of invention or cost-cutting. It reflected a deeper cultural shift. America was moving toward convenience culture, a mindset that everything should be faster, cheaper, and more accessible. even if that meant removing the human element. Neighborhood grocery stores were replaced by sprawling supermarket chains. This change alone destroyed the livelihoods of milkmen, produced delivery drivers and local shopkeepers. Consumers preferred the speed and low prices of centralized distribution over the familiarity of personal service. What once required a personal handshake now required only a shopping cart and fluorescent lighting. Economic pressures also played a heavy hand. The oil crisis, inflation, and recession of the 1970s forced businesses to make harsh decisions. Small professions, shoe shiners, projectionists, typists were the first casualties. Even jobs considered charming or culturally valuable could not survive. An era that demanded higher efficiency and lower overhead. When companies streamlined operations, they cut the roles that technology could replace. When families tightened budgets, they abandoned services that seemed optional. A perfect storm of financial pressure eroded the remaining stability these professions had left. At the same time, the ambitions of younger generations were shifting. College enrollments rose dramatically, and office jobs became the new aspirational target. The prestige once associated with trades and service jobs declined. Very few young Americans aspired to become repairmen, porters, projectionists, or elevator operators. As older workers retired, there were simply no newcomers stepping in to fill the void. The pipeline dried up. Entire professions withered, not because they weren't needed, but because no one chose to inherit them. Meanwhile, automation swept across industries like a cold, relentless tide. Bowling alleys adopted mechanical pin setters. Hotels installed automatic doors. Parking garages introduced self-service ticket systems. Movie theaters converted to automated projectors that could run an entire night's program without human intervention. These machines were marketed not as replacements for workers, but as upgrades. Yet with each upgrade, a little more of the human workforce vanished. The disappearance was slow but inevitable. It unfolded step by step, decision by decision. A grocery chain expanding here, a new machine installed there, a company laying off a handful of workers in a town most Americans had never heard of. No single event marked the turning point, because the transition was not an explosion. It was an erosion. By the time the decade closed, America had changed in ways that would have been unthinkable at its start. Neighborhoods no longer echoed with the ring of a milk truck, the clatter of typewriters, or the morning rush of paperboys on bicycles. Stations no longer buzzed with the voices of porters helping passengers board trains. Repair trucks no longer lined suburban streets. Everywhere that machines appeared, people disappeared. What was lost was more than jobs. It was a way of life, one built on familiarity, human interaction, and local trust. The workforce of the 1970s did not vanish overnight. It dissolved into history, replaced by systems that valued efficiency over connection. And with every job that disappeared, a small piece of America's identity disappeared with it. To truly understand the disappearance of so many 1970s professions, we have to look beyond economics, beyond technology, beyond the mechanics of change, because at its core, this story isn't about devices replacing people. It's about what those people meant to their neighborhoods, to their families, to American culture. These jobs, though simple on the surface, played roles far deeper than their job descriptions suggested. When they vanished, something more than employment was lost. A way of living disappeared. For many families, the workers of the 1970s were woven into the rhythms of daily life. The milkman, for example, wasn't just dropping off bottles. He was bringing a sense of consistency to households. His early morning footsteps on the porch were as familiar as the sunrise. Families knew his name. He knew theirs. He saw children grow up, watched seasons change, and witnessed everyday life unfold from one doorstep to another. When milk delivery ended, it wasn't just a service that disappeared, it was a relationship. The paperboy held a similar place in the American story. This job, often the first real responsibility for young boys and girls, taught generations about work ethic, punctuality, and community. In many neighborhoods, people still remember their paperboy decades later. How he rode his bike between houses, how he waved, how he braved the rain or snow to keep the news coming. The role created a bridge between youth and adulthood. When newspaper routes became automated or simply dissolved, that rite of passage vanished too. Inside the home, the TV repairman was more than a technician. He was a familiar, reassuring presence, a kind of domestic problem solver. In the 70s, when televisions were the centerpiece of family life, a malfunction meant the loss of entertainment, connection, and routine. The repairman's visit brought not just a fix but relief. Families often offered him coffee, conversation, and gratitude. He wasn't a stranger, he was a trusted guest. And then, there were the workers whose roles created a sense of order in public life. Train station porters, redcaps, and baggage handlers made travel feel human. They weren't just lifting suitcases, they were easing anxieties, offering directions, and providing stability in a world that often felt overwhelming. A porter could tell if someone was nervous about traveling alone. He knew which passengers needed an extra moment, which families were rushing, which elderly traveler needed an arm to lean on. Machines cannot provide that warmth. Other disappearing jobs added texture to the urban landscape. Shoe shiners in airports, and downtown squares polishing shoes while exchanging small talk gave business districts a heartbeat. Photomat booth clerks tucked inside their tiny kiosks developed precious family memories long before digital photos existed. Elevator operators, stationed in department stores and hotels, greeted guests with courtesy, conversation, and charm. They weren't just pressing buttons, they were setting the tone for the entire building. These professions also shaped the social identity of the decade. They represented the last era in which American life depended deeply on human skills. Before customer service became a script, before repair work became a lost art, before corporations turned efficiency into the measure of everything, the people in these jobs represented craftsmanship, dedication, and dignity. They were living examples of a time when hard work was praised, when reliability was valued, when competence commanded respect. Most importantly, these roles built community connection. Neighborhoods had faces they recognized, daily, weekly, seasonally. Children grew up seeing the same workers over and over, internalizing the idea that everyone had a role, a purpose, a place. Losing these workers meant losing the familiar fabric that held communities together. After their disappearance, life became a little more anonymous, a little more distant, a little colder. These disappearing jobs weren't glamorous. They weren't high-paying. They didn't make headlines, but they provided something modern life struggles to replace: human presence, a sense of being part of something larger, a reminder that behind every service, every convenience, every routine, there once stood a person. What vanished in the late 70s wasn't just employment, it was connection, it was continuity, it was a kind of social warmth that's far harder to find in the digital era. As we move deeper into our journey through the forgotten jobs of 1970s America, we arrive at a profession that perfectly captures the era's rhythm of everyday life: the traveling repairman. This wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline. A familiar knock on the door, a friendly face carrying a worn leather toolkit, someone who knew your name, remembered your kids, and understood every quirk of your old appliances, because they'd been fixing them for years. In the 1970s, homes across America were filled with machines built to last. Heavy refrigerators, sturdy washing machines, analog radios, rotary phones, and early color TVs. These weren't disposable pieces of technology. They were long-term companions, and when something broke, replacing it was almost unthinkable. You called your guy, a traveling repairman who made house calls, charged fair prices, and saved families from unnecessary expenses. But beyond the practical service, these repairmen played a social and cultural role. They were trusted, they were respected. Their work was hands-on, skillful, and deeply personal. They diagnosed problems by sound, by touch, by instinct, skills earned through years of experience rather than corporate training, manuals or digital diagnostics. Many of them ran independent businesses, driving from neighborhood to neighborhood in vans filled with spare parts. Soldering irons, tubes, wires, belts, gears. Tiny pieces of a mechanical world that has all but disappeared. So why did this profession fade away? Everything changed as America entered the 1980s and beyond. Technology began evolving at breakneck speed. Appliances became cheaper to manufacture. Electronics shifted from mechanical designs to sealed. Digital systems that were harder to fix and easier to replace. Big corporations started producing devices that were intentionally disposable, fast to buy, fast to break, and fast to replace. Repairing no longer made economic sense. Then came globalization. Mass-produced electronics from overseas flooded the American market at prices no independent repairman could compete with. And as warranty systems, big box stores, and centralized service networks took over, the personal house call culture slowly vanished. By the 2000s, the traveling repairman was nearly extinct. But what makes this loss so heartbreaking is not just the disappearance of a job, it's the disappearance of an entire way of living. A way that valued fixing instead of replacing. A way that valued relationships instead of transactions. A way that treated everyday tools as meaningful objects worth keeping alive. Today, people nostalgically recall the hum of a repair van pulling into the driveway, the smell of warm solder, the soft clicking of tools, and the comforting feeling that someone could always fix whatever was broken. It was a time when craftsmanship was common, when local economy mattered, and when service felt human. And so as we look back, the traveling repairman becomes more than just a profession. It becomes a symbol of resilience, skill, and the deeply personal connection people once had with the tools of their lives. It reminds us of an America where jobs were tangible, where independence meant something, and where the word repair wasn't considered outdated. This is why the loss of this profession hits so deeply. It takes with it a sense of tradition, craftsmanship, and community that defined the 1970s. It's not just a job that disappeared. It's a piece of American identity that quietly slipped away. As we continue our journey into the forgotten jobs of 1970s America, we now step into a world that feels almost mythical to younger generations. A world where the neighborhood milkman wasn't just a service provider, but a symbol of daily life, community rhythm, and small-town trust. During the 1950s and 60s, and still lingering into the early 1970s, the milkman was an essential figure in American neighborhoods. Their arrival was as predictable as the sunrise. Quiet footsteps at dawn, the soft clinking of glass bottles, the gentle thud of a cooler left by the front door. For millions of families, especially in suburban and rural communities, fresh milk delivery was as ordinary as checking the mailbox. But beyond the milk itself, these deliveries represented stability. The milkman was often the first person awake in the neighborhood. They noticed if a home looked unusual. They knew if someone had been out of town. They knew which families had growing kids who needed extra milk, who preferred cream-top bottles, and who always forgot to rinse their empties. Their work required punctuality, physical endurance, and an intimate understanding of their community. They weren't anonymous delivery workers. They were familiar faces, known by name and trusted with access to front porches and occasionally even unlocked kitchens. Yet by the late 1970s, the job that once felt timeless began to crumble. Slowly at first, and then all at once. Why the milkman disappeared? The decline wasn't the result of a single change, but a combination of powerful cultural shifts that reshaped American life. 1. The rise of supermarkets. The biggest blow came with the explosive growth of modern supermarkets. These new stores offered convenience, variety, and, most importantly, refrigerated dairy aisles. Families could now pick up milk anytime at far cheaper prices than home delivery services. Economies of scale pushed costs down, making the milkman model harder to sustain. 2. The spread of affordable home refrigeration. In the 1970s, refrigerators became bigger, cheaper, and more reliable. Families no longer needed daily deliveries to keep milk fresh. A single weekly grocery trip replaced the milkman's daily route. Technology didn't just change homes. It dismantled the economic foundation of an entire profession. 3. The suburban boom and route inefficiency. As suburbs expanded farther out, milk routes became longer, less predictable, and more expensive to operate. Higher fuel prices during the 1970s, energy crisis made daily deliveries increasingly unprofitable. What once was a simple neighborhood loop turned into a logistical headache. 4. Changing cultural rhythms. In earlier decades, most homes had a stay-at-home parent, making early morning deliveries safe and practical. But by the 1970s, dual-income households were rising fast. Neighborhoods became emptier during the day. Routines shifted, and the steady rhythm that sustained the milkman tradition dissolved. 5. Packaging innovations. Glass bottles gave way to cartons and plastic jugs, cheaper, lighter, easier to mass produce, and less fragile. This single innovation removed one of the milkman's central logistical roles, retrieving empties. What America lost when the milkman vanished. The milkman wasn't just a worker, he was part of the social fabric. His disappearance represented something deeper. The fading of local, personalized services that tied communities together. Families lost daily human connection, even in the quietest early hours. The feeling of being looked after. The small rituals that defined neighborhood life. The slower, more predictable rhythm of 1970s mornings. For many older Americans, the sound of milk bottles clinking remains one of the most vivid, sensory memories of their childhood. It symbolizes innocence, simplicity, and a time before everything became on demand, digital, and impersonal. And today, as we look back from a world of 24/7 grocery delivery apps, giant retail chains, and automated logistics, the milkman stands as a reminder of a forgotten America. An America built on face-to-face service, trust, and routine. This wasn't just a job that disappeared, it was a cultural heartbeat that quietly faded out as the nation modernized. Before smartphones, before speed dial, before the internet connected every corner of life in an instant, there was a profession that served as the invisible nervous system of America, the switchboard operator. And in the 1970s, especially in small towns and mid-sized cities, this role was still alive, still essential, and still carried out by thousands of skilled workers, mostly women, who held together the nation's communication lines. Picture this: a dimly lit room filled with rows of towering switchboards, glowing indicator lights and cables hanging like vines. A handful of operators sit before them, wearing headsets, hands moving rapidly with a sense of confidence and grace, plugging, connecting, transferring, rerouting, each motion precise, each connection made by human hands. It was a dance, a rhythm, a highly choreographed job that required quick thinking, perfect memory, and a calm voice. Operators could connect dozens of calls per minute while juggling emergencies, long-distance requests, busy signals, and unfamiliar numbers. They knew which circuits were overloaded and which lines needed a gentle reset. And in small towns, they often knew every subscriber personally. For many Americans, the switchboard operator was the first voice they heard whenever they needed help, information, or connection. But the job was far more complex than simply connecting calls. Operators were the frontline responders of their era. They patched through urgent calls during storms and blackouts. They helped doctors, police, and fire departments when systems overloaded. They checked on elderly residents when something seemed off. They calmed frightened callers during late-night emergencies. And perhaps most uniquely, they were trusted holders of community secrets. Illnesses, arguments, romances, late-night confessions, all passed through the board. The decline, however, began quietly in the 1970s. Technology was catching up. Electronic switching systems, faster, cheaper, and fully automated, were being rolled out across the country. Machine-based routing replaced human memory. Mechanical signals replaced the soft reassurance of a human voice. And within a couple of decades, one of the most essential jobs in early American telecommunications simply vanished. Why did this job disappear so completely? It wasn't just automation, it was the shifting expectation of communication itself. People no longer wanted intermediaries, they wanted privacy, instant dialing, speed, and eventually the mobile freedom of personal phones. The same forces that shaped the modern digital world swept away the need for human switchboard operators. Yet something profound was lost. The warm voice on the other end of the line, the sense that someone was always there, literally connecting you to the world. The human safety net built into the communication system. Today, older Americans can still recall the soft click of a line being connected, the polite "number please," and the familiar tone of their local operator, who always seemed to know exactly what they needed. It was a job that blended service, skill, intuition, and human connection, all traits that automation couldn't replicate. And so the switchboard operator became another symbol of a bygone America, an America where connection required people, where communication wasn't just mechanical, it was personal, where the human element mattered just as much as the message being sent. This is the world that disappeared when switchboards went silent. As we close this journey through the forgotten professions of 1970s, America, one truth becomes unmistakably clear. What disappeared wasn't just a collection of jobs, it was a way of life. These roles, from the traveling repairman to the milkman to the switchboard operator, were woven into the rhythm of daily American living. They shaped neighborhoods, connected families, and gave communities their identity. They were the heartbeat of a slower, more personal America. When a repairman knew every appliance in your home, when a milkman's footsteps at dawn meant the start of a new day, when a switchboard operator's steady voice guided people through emergencies, storms, and late-night worries, these weren't just tasks. They were relationships. They were rituals. They were anchors. But as the decades passed, technology surged forward. Automation replaced hands. Globalization replaced local services. Big corporations replaced the small, familiar faces that once made neighborhoods feel like extended families. Convenience won. But something human was lost in the process. And what we lost wasn't just work. We lost the sound of tools clicking on a kitchen table, the clink of glass bottles on a porch, the warmth of a voice that connected you to the world. We lost the comfort of knowing that someone in your community, a real person, had your back. Today, in an age of instant messages, digital assistants, anonymous deliveries, and disposable everything, these old professions feel almost mythical. Yet they live on in the memories of those who experienced them, in faded photographs, in family stories, and in the quiet nostalgia that reminds us of who we once were. And as we look back, we realize something important. The jobs didn't only vanish because technology advanced. They vanished because society changed. We changed, but remembering them matters. Because these professions remind us of a time when America felt smaller, closer, and more connected. Not through screens, but through people. Through hands, voices, faces, and shared experiences. So as we end this chapter, let it stand as a tribute to the men and women whose everyday labor shaped the soul of a nation. A tribute to craftsmanship, community, and human connection. A tribute to the world we came from. A world that may be gone, but still echoes in our hearts. This was more than history. This was the story of the hands that built America, and the quiet, gradual moment when those hands began to fade.